War of the Worlds, The Resurrection, a novel by J.M. Dillard. October 1988. Chapter 1. Yurik sat in the tractor-trailer's cab and watched the dark landscape fly by. Next to her, Chambers held the rig at a steady 55. No point in tempting the cops by speeding. There was nothing to see in the desert at night, and after Yurik's initial terror subsided into restless impatience, she began to find the drive boring, to become eager to reach their destination. The plan was in motion now. She glanced over at Chambers and thought, what would happen if I asked him to pull over, if I jumped out of the cab and hiked my way back to town? Would she go back to being the same person she had always been? Lena Yurik, perennially broke, overage college student, always pushing back graduation another year because she had to work overtime to pay the rent. Was there still time to stop this before things went too far? You've already gone too far. You've broken the law, stolen a truck, carried a weapon without a license. And then there's conspiracy. There was no going back to the way things used to be, and there was no point in lying to herself. She couldn't back out if she wanted to. Chambers wouldn't let her go. She thought of the Uzis hidden behind their seats. An image flashed in her mind of her fleeing from the rig into the desert, of Chambers calmly pulling the Uzi from the back seat and taking aim. Would he kill you? Could he really kill you? The answer was undoubtedly yes. And in Yurik's mind, he would be entirely justified in killing her. She would not have respected him if he were not prepared to kill for the cause. Yet another part of her, the weaker, timid part of herself she thought of as Lena, her old self, felt the opposite. Yurik thought of her former self, Lena, as another person. No longer a part of Yurik, free soldier of the People's Liberation Army, but someone else, a coward, always afraid. She insisted her comrades call her only by her last name, Yurik, and Yurik was cool, dedicated, unafraid, just like Chambers, who radiated perfect calm sitting there next to her. She considered for an instant that he might be as frightened as she, but dismissed the idea as ridiculous. She'd been through their route 1,000 times before, but she pulled the map from the glove compartment and unfolded it, leaving the compartment open so that she could read by its faint light. She didn't even consider asking Chambers to turn on the overhead. The less seen of their faces, the better. She stared once again at the route underlined in red, east into the desert. Though the map was unnecessary, she could have drawn it from memory. She looked down at her watch, the one present from her father she had ever permitted herself to keep. She would have thrown it out the window right then if she hadn't needed it to carry out the plan. No point in anything tying her to the past, to the old Lena, and certainly not to her father. Besides, it was expensive, gold, a symbol of everything she stood against now. When Lena was 15, her family had left Germany to come to the United States. Her father, a working-class man, a firm believer in the capitalist dream, had opened a deli. Then 2, then 3, until he was a rich man who owned an entire chain. Nothing narrowed a person's mind faster, Lena learned, than the acquisition of wealth. What would her father say if he knew what she was doing now? You think you know it all, don't you, Lena? She could hear him start with that lecturing tone. So quick to judge, thinking only in shades of black and white. But the world isn't that way. It's all shades of gray, and you shouldn't judge a man until you've been in his position. I know what's right, Papa, and you'll see. Someday I'm going to save the world. From what? From itself. From political oppression. A sigh, a shake of the head. My daughter, the martyr. There's more than one way to save the world, Lena. Lena might have listened, But Uruk knew better. The only shades of gray came from those people who lived corrupted lives. She was here to cleanse the world from unscrupulous men like her father, and from corrupt, decadent governments like the one in Washington, whose morality was dictated by the almighty dollar. Uruk registered the time. At least they were on schedule. She felt a tightness in her chest and practiced breathing slowly, methodically, then glanced out of the corner of her eye at Chambers, knowing that the sight of him would calm her. The lights on the highway reflected off the lens of his wire-rimmed glasses. They were still close enough to the city for there to be occasional traffic this late at night. He was older than she, in his early 40s, a quiet man possessed of incredible determination, and he had a strange way of sensing when she was thinking about him. He caught her sly glance, tilted his face toward her. A handsome face, with compelling eyes and thick brown hair that was swept back to reveal a high forehead, the sign of great intelligence, her mother had always said. Chambers gave Uruk a slight, encouraging smile. She returned it. She was not afraid to die, she decided, so long as she died with him. A brilliant man, Chambers, a political science professor at UCLA, unlike any other college professor Uruk had known. For Chambers possessed strong beliefs, and he believed in acting on those principles. From the first lecture, Lena Uruk had been mesmerized, yet it was more than just a schoolgirl crush. No, it was a political awakening for her, and she refused to let their relationship be cheapened by such emotions. For his part, Chambers maintained a scrupulously paternal attitude toward her. Uruk thought of him as the man her father would have been had greed not corrupted him. She forced herself to look back down at the map. They were less than an hour away from their destination, away from the line Uruk knew she must cross, after which there could be no turning back. "Damn," Chambers said softly in his deep voice. The rig shuddered and whined as he downshifted. She looked over at him, startled. "What's wrong?" The instant she said it, she saw the flashing light reflected off the side mirror. Her heart began thumping wildly. "Don't know." Chambers eased on the brake and pulled over to the shoulder. The rig groaned to a halt. Uruk stared at the police cruiser reflected in the mirror, then at Chambers. He didn't look at her. He was busy watching the uniformed policeman walk up to the driver's side of the cab. Uruk moved to reach for the guns behind the seat. Chambers held up his hand. "Not yet." She drew her hand away and forced herself to sit, to not look panic-stricken. Chambers peered down through the open window of the cab and smiled at the policeman. "I'll need to see your operator's permit and waybill," the cop said with the voice of a man in his early 20s. Theoretically, Uruk hated the cop because of the role he played in repressing society. Personally, she had nothing against him, and was unsettled at the thought of using the Uzi this soon, against someone so young. When she thought of killing, she pictured herself killing corrupt old men her father's age, not kids barely out of school. "Is there a problem, officer?" Chambers was playing it just right, polite because he didn't want to get a ticket, with the barest hint of irritation at being pulled over. In the midst of her fear, Uruk felt a surge of admiration for him. The cop did not reply. He gestured for Chambers to hand over the documents. As Chambers sighed and reached for the glove compartment, Uruk caught his eye with a look that said, "Do you think he knows? Shall I reach for the Uzis?" She didn't dare whisper it with the cop so nearby. Chambers shrugged. "No, not yet." She helped him find the forged permit and the waybill. Chambers handed them down to the cop. There was a pause, and then, "Please step out of the vehicle, Mr. Chambers." Uruk held her breath as Chambers opened the door and complied. She caught a brief glimpse of the cop before Chambers slammed the door shut. A blonde-haired kid who looked too young to shave and was giving Chambers that stern, chip-on-the-shoulder stare. There was no reason to be so near panic. Cops always made you get out of the car. But why the hell did they stop this rig? Chambers hadn't even been speeding. All the way to the rear, the cop said. Chambers' boots crunched against the gravel as he moved to the rear of the truck. Urich slid over to the driver's side and craned her neck out the window to watch. The blonde cop followed Chambers to the back of the truck, where a second cop was waiting. They were going to make Chambers open it. And they were going to get one hell of a surprise. Urich peered into the side mirror and strained to listen. The young cop was still talking, though he and the other cop had stepped out of view. Chambers, slightly off to one side, was just visible. "Waybill doesn't list your freight, Mr. Chambers. Just 1 metric ton. Chambers sounded indignant. "Company didn't hire me to do the paperwork." "Any objection to us having a look?" In the flashing light, she could see Chambers' silhouette shrug and pull the key from his chest pocket. There was going to be shooting. She should have scrunched down inside the cab to protect herself, but Chambers was talking. She was frightened for him, and wanted to hear what he would say. His tone was casual as he proffered the key. "If you don't mind, I'll wait in your car while you poke around. Stuff in there's low-grade nuclear waste. They usually pack it up real good, but me and the missus still plan on having a few kids." It was the story they'd rehearsed 1,000 times for this very emergency, but the line about the kids and the request to sit in the cruiser were ad-libbed. She could have laughed out loud. Perfect, Chambers. That way he could hide in the safety of the police car, if the cops still felt like poking around. She grinned in the dark cab and waited. There was a long pause as the cops presumably took notice of Chambers' clean white jumpsuit and made the desired connection. Then the cop's partner spoke. "Reason we pulled you over, Mr. Chambers, you've got to shorten your taillights." "I'll check it right away, officer." "Do that," the young one said. "Drive careful now, okay?" A door slammed, the flashing light was replaced by headlights, and the sound of the cruiser wheeling away at top speed. She climbed out of the cab and joined Chambers, who stood watching them leave. She wanted to gloat, to congratulate him on his cleverness, but, as usual, he was thinking only of what had to be done. "Taillights out," he said shortly, dropping the key back into his pocket and giving it a pat. "Check the fuse and let's roll. We're behind schedule." He headed back to the cab, slapping the rear door of the trailer as he passed by. On the 9-foot chain-link fence that ran alongside the road, the sign read, "Jericho Valley Disposal Site. Authorized personnel only. Entrance 1,000 yards." A strange little song began to repeat in Urich's mind, a song she hadn't thought of in years. Joshua in the Battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Joshua in the Battle of Jericho. And the walls come tumbling down. Chambers downshifted and maneuvered the rig past the sign and onto the narrow gravel path leading to the first gate. They'd driven along in silence after the taillight incident. At some point, even in the darkness, Urich could tell that Chambers was nervous. For some strange reason, the thought calmed her, and the closer they drew to the disposal site, the stronger her sense of unreality became. Chambers sounded the air horn. Urich looked down at the glowing numbers on her watch. Right on schedule. 2 helmeted soldiers stepped out of the guard shack on the other side of the gate. One of them hit a switch, and the outer gate slid open. Chambers put the tractor-trailer in low gear and eased it past the gate, which closed behind them. Urich read more signs on the guard shack. "Federal Reserve. No trespassing allowed. Nuclear and toxic waste stored here." Urich didn't glance at her surroundings. She'd already memorized them. It was a tiny base consisting of nothing more than a small barracks, a guard shack, and stack after stack of steel barrels. One of the soldiers came up to the driver's side of the cab and without a word reached up for the paperwork Chambers handed down. Unlike the cop, the soldier seemed satisfied with what he read. He nodded at his partner, who responded by pressing another switch. The inner gate behind the guard shack slid open. Chambers rolled the tractor-trailer past it and let go a shaky sigh. So he was terrified after all, Yurik thought with a twinge of disappointment. Not that it mattered. Not that anything mattered, except what she had to do. And it was almost time. She reached into the space between the seat and the back of the cab and carefully pulled out the Uzi. Chambers was already out as she climbed down, keeping the hand with the Uzi behind her back. The soldiers had come out the rear door of the guard shack and were approaching the rig with smiles on their faces. Young corporals, clean-shaven, barely 20 years old. "This is the enemy," Yurik told herself. "These are dead men." In every revolution, Chambers had explained, there had to be deaths. "We don't relish killing, but to achieve our goals we must sacrifice some on the altar of world freedom. Perhaps if our victims knew the good their deaths would bring, they would volunteer." Yurik studied their leering faces and doubted it. Typical army types, probably enlisted for no better reason than to get a free education. Suddenly, she was filled with overwhelming hatred for them. "Got some fresh coffee in the shack," one of them said pleasantly to her, making her realize that the smiles were for her alone. Chambers answered before she could. "Maybe later," he said stonily. The other corporal took a step nearer. "When did you folks add women to your crews?" "Are you threatened by a woman, soldier?" Yurik asked. Her voice had a shrill edge to it. Stupid of her to argue. She should have simply killed him. "No, ma'am," the questioner answered politely. "I just like him is all." Her hand tightened on the Uzi. Lena fled forever, leaving only Yurik, and Yurik realized with an eerie thrill that she was going to enjoy what she was about to do. She smiled coldly at the soldiers. "What a nice thing to say." She drew the Uzi out for them to see, and pointed it at the one who offered coffee. The effect on them was gratifying. The corporals gasped in unison and thrust their hands into the air. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw that Chambers smiled. He was pleased with her performance, then. He was the one who suggested she handle the Uzi, because they'd never expect any trouble from a woman, he'd said. But she knew it was to test her loyalty. There was but one last line to cross. "What the hell's going on?" the coffee drinker demanded. "Liberation, my friend," Chambers told him. One of them moved. Yurik didn't know which, but her fingers squeezed the trigger without her consciously deciding to do so. Because of the silencer, the burst made very little noise as it tore into Corporal Coffee, lifting him off his feet and knocking him a good yard backward and down. She looked at him lying there, the front of his uniform shredded and blood-soaked, and felt nothing. The remaining corporal made a noise, something like a sob. He raised his hands even higher as he backed away from Yurik and the gun, his face contorted. "My God, lady, why?" She raised the Uzi again. "Hey, just cool it, okay?" His voice rose to hysterical pitch. "It's okay, soldier," she told him calmly, sweetly, and smiled to herself as he relaxed a little. She was aware of Chambers' eyes on her, a little surprised that she was toying with her victim, but she didn't care. "Everything's cool." She squeezed the trigger again. The second corporal fell back, his expression startled. No time to think now. Only work to be done. Chambers went over to the rig and opened a side panel. He set up the rocket launcher while Yurik, the Uzi dancing on a strap slung over one shoulder, ran to the back of the trailer, unlatched the doors and swung them wide. Inside the trailer, engines revved. Joshua in the Battle of Jericho. Exhilaration replaced fear. She had done it. She had killed 2 men for the good of the revolution, and she had not shrunk from the task. If anything, she had enjoyed it. Yurik peered inside the trailer, wanting to share that feeling with her 4 comrades, but Mossoud, Finney, Teal, and Einhorn were indistinguishable from one another. The visors of their black helmets were already down so that she couldn't catch their eyes. Yurik ran to one side, out of the way as the 4 all-terrain vehicles roared out of the trailer. Standing by the side of the truck, Chambers aligned the sights on the launcher and located his target. A compact missile whined through the air, across the yard. The barracks building exploded. Yurik covered her head as debris went flying, but she kept moving. What she was looking for would be on the sheltered bulletin board near the guard shack. Behind her came the fire of automatic weapons, but she wasn't frightened. The ATVs had machine guns mounted on their handlebars. She found the duty roster neatly stapled in a conspicuous spot on the bulletin boards. She tore it off and ran back toward the truck. Something she saw on her way there made her stop. Down an aisle created by waste barrels, new ones stacked on top of ancient rusty ones, an ATV rider had been knocked from his vehicle by a soldier armed only with a piece of lumber. 2x4 raised over his head, the soldier was moving in on the fallen rider to finish the job. He had managed to get the weapon mounted on the ATV. Yurik dropped the roster and began to run toward the ATV, her Uzi at the ready. Without even thinking about what would happen if the soldier got there before she was close enough to take aim, she hadn't taken 2 steps before a second ATV appeared and fired at the soldier. The blast slammed him, mouth gaping back against the barrels. Another barrage held him there for an instant before he slid to the ground, leaving a bloody smear on the barrel behind him. Good, Yurik thought, and realized with a sudden jolt that she was smiling. It had all been so easy. Too easy. None of it had been real, she decided. The people they had killed were not real people. She turned and picked the roster up out of the dust and brushed it off. It was suddenly very quiet on the base. The 4 ATVs had returned to the truck and shut down their engines. Finney was the first one to take off his helmet, its visor spattered with blood. The others followed suit. Masood, tall and swarthy, not to be trusted. Teal, a short, wiry, serious man. Einhorn, with his many times broken nose. Finney laughed, running his fingers through his thick blonde hair. He was wearing the same strange, slightly hysterical smile Yurik knew was on her own lips. She had always despised Finney. As she approached, Finney was replying to something Chambers had asked. "None on our team," he said, still grinning. "But Masood got knocked for a loop." Masood wasn't smiling. His tone was more than a little defensive. "Just having me some fun." He rubbed his shoulder and grimaced. "Had that dude in my sights the whole time." Right, arrogant fool Masood. She knew he didn't believe in the revolution. He and Finney were doing this for the sport of it. And if things didn't work out the way they wanted, they would turn on Chambers in an instant. She tried to warn Chambers before about them, but he refused to listen. A pity that honest leaders like Chambers had to recruit such self-serving jerks. She stepped up next to Chambers, trying to make her expression more serious, like his. Duty roster lists 17 men, 1 officer. She held it so he could see it. 4 non-coms, 12 enlisted. The officer would have been the one swinging the 2x4, she decided. He'd worn a lieutenant's gold bar on his collar. The non-coms included the corporals she'd killed. Chambers nodded. "Masood? Finney?" His voice was serious, authoritative enough to make Finney stop gloating and listen. "Do a body count. Make sure there are no stragglers. Teal, Einhorn, set up the perimeter charges." The others filed off, and she and Chambers were left alone. She would have liked to talk to him then about the odd metamorphosis she had undergone, how frightened, insecure Lena was gone forever, and this strange, new, cold-blooded person had taken her place. But something about his manner held her back. Instead, she said, "Let's find a good place for the transmitter." They were heading for the side panel when the telephone in the guard shack began to ring. She started. Chambers put a hand on her shoulder. "Let it ring," he said. "The world's going to hear about us soon enough." And he actually smiled. She returned the smile gratefully. And the walls came tumbling down. Masood looked down at the lieutenant's bullet-ridden body and rubbed his aching shoulder one more time. "Serves you right, you son of a... thinking you could take me on." He bent down and felt for a wallet in the dead man's back pockets, then the hip pockets, then the pockets on the thighs. No go. Maybe he had it in one of his front pockets for some strange reason, in which case any money had been shredded into confetti by the machine gun blast. He heard the faintest noise, like a hiss. The guy breathing? Nah, impossible. Maybe just air seeping out of his perforated lungs. He ignored the sound and looked at the guy's wrist. Left one bare. Jesus, didn't this guy wear anything where he was supposed to? On the right wrist, Masood found what he was looking for. A watch with a gold band, 18 karat at least, with an inscription on the back. To Jeff, happy graduation, love Mom and Dad. Masood pulled it off the dead man and slipped it onto his wrist. A nice fit. He heard Finney coming and pulled the sleeve of his jacket down over his prize. Finney, give me a hand with this one. You check his pockets? Finney nudged the stiff with his boot before stooping over to take the guy's legs. Masood caught the body under the shoulders. Guy's got nothing worth taking. Masood answered innocently, then groaned as they lifted the body up. Can you believe it? All those goddamn pockets and not a thing in them? Neither noticed as, behind them, a thick caustic liquid hissed through a bullet hole in one of the newer barrels onto an old rusted barrel beneath it. The top of the rusty barrel sizzled as the toxic ooze ate through the metal. They were both gone by the time the 3 probing fingers of the alien's hand burst through.